Point size. I'm not sure if you've thought about this, but when you look at the drop-down menus for point size, in many cases you'll have predetermined dimensions. You might see 36, you might see 18, you might see 9. There'll be some other numbers, but there are certain point sizes that are really important because they are basically a fraction of a unit of measurement. And that unit of measurement is driven around this 72. Each point size is equal to 1/72nd of an inch, which means that a 72 point font equals 1 inch tall. You know that if you need a font face that is a half an inch tall, you would cut 72 in half, divide it by 2, or 50%, and you'll get 36. So a 36 point font is a half an inch, which then means that a quarter of an inch font is 18 points, which means an eighth of an inch font would be 9 points. So with this, you can rationalize how big or small the font is based on the numbers. So if you needed a 2-inch font, it would be 72 times 2, which is a little bit less than 150 points. Now, one thing that you need to be aware of is that Foundry fonts tend to follow this ratio. Foundry fonts are font bases that have been designed and developed by professional typesetters and font developers. There are also shareware fonts where people just make them themselves and they use a little software and they share them with one another. And many of those fonts are found on DaFont. In many cases, these shareware fonts are not designed at this ratio, so you have to be really careful with that. And in some fonts in general, even Foundry fonts might be a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller. So this is a general rule of thumb. So what font size do you use? Should you use 6 points? Should you use 12 points? A lot of students, when they write their papers, their instructors say use 12-point font. So what do you do? Well, it depends on two things. It depends on the context. And it depends on what is the most feasible and rational thing to do on that document. So for example, in most documents, most print documents, 6 points is too small and it's very difficult to read. 12 tends to be overly comfortable and consumes a lot of space. In the corporate world, if we're talking about print and we're developing something that the user is going to hold in their hands, they're going to select a 12-point font. Ultimately, you want to work and use something that looks best. So in this presentation, my bullet point fonts are approximately 48 points. That's what looks good in this presentation. So it's neither 6, neither 12, neither 10. It's what's going to look best for this particular presentation. So if you're going to design a poster that's meant to be seen 10 feet away, you're not going to work with smaller fonts. You're going to work with larger fonts. If you're going to work with a menu that's held at an arm's length, you're going to make different choices. It depends on what it is that you're developing and constructing. Tracking. Tracking is a term that describes all of the spaces between the letters in one word. So we said that one space, for example, if we were to look at the space between the T and the R, if you're only looking at one space, that's referred to as the kern. When we are looking at all of the spaces at once within a letter or within a line or within a paragraph, that's referred to as the tracking. So that's the spaces between the letters. Now, in many cases, the tracking and the kern is generally customized by those who are really concerned with typography. So generally speaking, somebody who's a designer or who's been acting as a professional visual artist is going to be more concerned about those spaces than the average person who's developing a document. Tracking and kerning can take a lot of time, and because of that, it's generally focused on lines of text that have a greater importance. For example, headers, titles, pull quotes, anything that's really emphasized in the copy. Generally speaking, the bulk of the copy, the paragraphs, that's referred to as body. Generally speaking, tracking is not really something that designers tend to focus on within the body unless there's a very obvious mistake. And the reason for that is that it's very time consuming. So tracking is a combination of both paying attention to the spaces between the letters and also considerations for the kern, one specific space between the letters. So if you were to remove a space or increase a space within one of the pair of letters, that's referred to as kerning. And that's the act of adding or subtracting a space from each letter, or the negative space between the letters. Leading. So leading is the space between the lines of text, so from top to bottom. So you'll notice that the column of text on the left has a smaller space between the lines. The column in the center tends to have a default space between the lines. The column on the right has a larger space. So when we're looking at these different spaces between the lines of text, what we're describing here, what we're looking at, is a change in the lead. The leading variable tends to be, by default in the software, a 1.2 to 1 ratio. So that means that if you're working with 10-point font, the leading should by default be set to 12. That means that if it's a 20-point font, the leading should be default at 24. The leading is a concern because the larger the lead, it tends to be easier to read. Now this is all within reason. I'm sure if you made the lead so big and so severe, it would disconnect the lines and they wouldn't look like a collective group. They might look like separate lines of text altogether. But you'll notice that when you compare the column on the left and the column on the right, it's easier to look and read and deconstruct the text on the right. That column on the right, your eye can move from one line to the next. You can read Lorem ipsum dolor sit amet, and then your eye can track to the left and find the starting point for the next line with greater ease and efficiency. If you were to do the same thing on the column on the left, the one with the real tight lead, you have to focus a little bit more, you have to work a little bit harder to catch that next line. Which brings up something that's really important. That efficiency is really important in the effectiveness of legibility and the effectiveness of usability. If the user believes that the text is too difficult to read, they won't engage with it, they will dismiss it. They would rather just move on and find a block of information that's easier to grab. So when you're setting text, it's really important to sort of weigh and measure how legible the text is and how appropriate and accessible it is. In many cases, some great designers basically say that a layout should be constructed with transparency or in an invisible way. What they're really trying to say there is that the user just engages with it and they don't have to think about it. If you have to stop and think, for example, the way that you have to read that paragraph on the left, then you're basically creating an obstacle for the user, which may create a cynical response and they may no longer want to engage with the content. So you want to design your text and the variables that you choose with legibility in mind. Which one is easier to read?